again, and welcome to episode 4, season 4 of the Dorothy L. Sayers podcast. I'm your host, Lindsay Scholl, and the title of today's show is To Err is Evil. Why does it matter if writers get their facts a little off? Who's going to care? The ghost of Sayers might. Warning, if you are eating something, you may want to put it down for a moment. Imagine a young knight with a red cross painted on his armor. A full jolly knight he seemed, and fair did sit, as one for knightly jousts and fierce encounters fit. And ever as he rode, his heart did earn to prove his puissance in battles brave upon his foe, and his new force to learn. It's raining. He and his lady, as well as the exhausted dwarf behind them who has carried the bags, seek shelter in a shady grove whose lofty trees clad with summer's pride did spread so broad that heaven's light did hide. In they ride, enjoying the protection of a surprising variety of trees. The cedar, proud and tall, the builder oak, sole king of forests tall, the aspen, good for staves, the cypress funereal, and then there's a willow, the yew, the birch, the sallow, the fruitful olive, and so on. The knight, the lady, the dwarf, led with delight, thus beguile the way until the blustering storm is overblown. But alas, they cannot find that path which first was shown, but wander to and fro in ways unknown. Finally, they find a cave in the thickest part of the wood. The knight dismounts, giving his spear to the dwarf, ready to enter and face what perils he might find in that cave. The lady warns him not to. He says it's shameful not to face a hidden danger, but she says she knows where they are. This is a wandering wood, this error's den, a monster vile whom God and man does hate. Therefore I read, beware. Fly, fly, quoth in the fearful dwarf. This is no place for living men. The young knight ignores them both and enters the darkness. The only light is the dim reflection of his armor, by which he can see an ugly monster plain, half like a serpent horribly displayed, but the other half did woman's shape retain, most loathsome, filthy, foul, and full of vile disdain. And as she lay upon the dirty ground, her huge long tail her den all o'er spread. Yet was in knots and many bouts upwound, pointed with mortal sting. But the monster Error is not alone. Of her there bred 1,000 young ones, which she daily fed, sucking upon her poisonous dugs, each one of sundry shapes, yet all ill-favored. As soon as the baby monsters, since the light he brings, into her mouth they crept, and sudden all were gone. The angry mother lunges at the intruder, and they fight, knight against monstrosity, for 36 lines of Spenser's Fairy Queen, which is where this tale is from. The knight strikes Error on the head, and Error leapt fierce upon his shield, and her huge train all suddenly about his body wound. That hand or foot to stir he strove in vain. God help the man so wrapped in Error's endless train. The lady, who is really only there for encouragement, not for combat, cries out that now is the time to prove himself as a knight. Strangle the beast. He somehow gets one powerful hand out and begins to strangle it. Remember, its top half looks like a woman with a woman's neck. Therewith she spewed out her filthy maw, a flood of poison horrible and black, full of great lumps of flesh and gobbets raw, which stunk so vividly that it forced him slack his grasping hold, and from her turn him back. Her vomit full of books and papers was, with loathly frogs and toads, which eyes did lack, and creeping sought way into the weedy grass. Her filthy parbrake all the place defiled has. The knight, standing in a sludge of books, paper, bile, and frogs, can't stand the smell and almost gives up. The monster, sensing his weakness, continues to vomit, this time her own young. The deformed monsters, foul and black as ink, with swarming all about his legs did crawl, and him encumbered sore but could not hurt at all. Finally he recovers himself and, stroke at her with more than manly force, that from her body full of filthy sin he raft her hateful head without remorse. Her orphaned young race back to her corpse, suck up their mother's blood, and explode as a result of their gorging. The lady congratulates the knight for his victory, then he, mounted upon his steed again, and with the lady backwards sought to wend. That path he kept, which beaten was most plain, and never would to any byway bend, but still did follow unto the end, the which at last out of the wood them brought. As you probably figured out, that appetizing story is an allegory. Spenser wrote in England in the 1500s. Protestantism was a new thing, and the nation had been torn by religious division. The Red Cross Knight, therefore, represents the strong virtue of holiness. The lady, whose name is Una, is humble and beautiful and represents truth. The dwarf, who actually serves Lady Una, is mostly just there to help, and the monster error is error. This story is a good reminder for writers, because to write is to communicate, and to communicate is to share either truth or falsehood. I have not read The Fairy Queen. I actually found this story referenced in a note from Sayers to Barbara Reynolds when Sayers complains about errors in writing and research. I'm going to read you a chunk of the letter because she says it so much better than I could. By the way, I'm reading this from Volume 4 of her letters. The date is February 12, 1957. Dear Barbara, yes, it is frightening, and that's why I must be so careful to get everything properly checked up and not fall into error myself. Because the thing really doesn't seem believable. One doesn't often meet with error with a capital E, Spencer's monster vile, only with honest misunderstandings and mild stupidities. And if you tell people that intellectual error is sin, they think you are being snooty and absurd, because people can't help making mistakes and oughtn't to be blamed for it. Of course, we are all liable to error. That's just original sin, and nobody's fault in particular. But real error is wicked, and God help us, I think that's what we're up against. But I must be sure of the facts, because it is, as you say, so extremely easy to entertain error in the form of righteous indignation and hatred and contempt. Only the facts will save us. Like all of the topics of these writing episodes, Sayers models and preaches this idea of accuracy in too many places to quote. For her, and hopefully for us, accuracy is the job of any craftsman and any Christian if you identify with that. After all, she once proclaimed that the only Christian work is a work well done. The letter to Reynolds is in relation to a particular misrepresentation by a Latin translator of a 1st century Roman poet named Lucan. The wicked error Sayers is referring to is when the translator, Robert Graves, calls one of Lucan's observations on astronomy all nonsense in a footnote. Sayers is furious at Graves's tone and his misunderstanding. Her critiques are basically two. Graves's translation of the Latin is not very good, and what is worse, he does not give his subject the benefit of the doubt. Even to a less educated reader like myself, this is pretty clear from the translator's notes. The footnote where Graves says that Lucan is saying all nonsense is preceded by 2 footnotes. The first says that Lucan here confuses, and the other after that, Lucan errors, and then goes on. I also looked up the Graves translation on Goodreads, and one guy says that it's clear that the translator does not particularly like Lucan. Some of you may not have heard of Lucan. Sayers herself says that he is a second-rate Latin poet. Probably none of you care about how accurate Lucan was concerning constellations and planets. But that's not the point. Let me share more about the context of this letter about error and the War of Lucan's Astronomy, as Sayers dubbed it. While Robert Graves was apparently playing fast and loose with the work of a Roman poet he doesn't like, Sayers was translating the Chanson de Roland, or Song of Roland, for Penguin Press. She had been going back and forth with scholars about how to translate nuances of medieval French clothing and what to do with a pesky AOI, which keeps showing up throughout the Song of Roland. It's just like 3 capital letters and is apparently untranslatable. Anyway, at one point she complains to a fellow scholar who had been helping her, "Here are you and I devotedly toiling to get verse and sense both accurate, all agitated if an AOI is out of place, and there is that bloody man," that's Graves, "recklessly, and I believe deliberately, misinterpreting his author, mistranslating him, turning him into sheer, meaningless nonsense, sneering at him in footnotes for being nonsensical, and generally playing the cat and banjo with the thing. And that in prose, mind you, and no excuse for it, and as far as I can see, he gets away with it, nobody rebukes him, nobody cares." It's possibly because Lucan is a second-rate Latin poet that Graves should have translated him accurately. But nobody would catch it. Graves should have been more careful. Who else would defend Lucan if his own translator doesn't? Sayers once said that she was a novelist by accident, but a scholar by training. The War of Lucan's Astronomy is an example of scholarly zeal for accuracy. Though she was busy with other work, she actually did try to recreate Lucan's astronomical observations and checked her findings with a young student of astronomy at New College, Oxford, named Brian Marsden. Marsden later worked for the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, and in 1987, long after Sayers passed away, published an article saying that Sayers was justified to challenge Graves. Look, you don't have to be a scholar to avoid error. You do have to do your homework, as well as give your subjects some credit, especially if you are writing or translating history. But accuracy is not just for nonfiction. Sayers researched her novels almost as zealously as she researched her academic work. For her second novel, Clouds of Witness, Sayers imagines that Lord Peter's elder brother, the Duke of Denver, is accused of murder. As a peer of the realm, he is due to a trial by his peers, that is, members of the House of Lords. Sayers recounts this parliamentary procedure with apparent accuracy, including the appointment of a Lord High Steward to try the case. Here's an excerpt from a letter to her parents from March 1922, in which she describes one of the ways she researched the book. I've got hold of Sir Arthur Marshall, whom I mentioned to you as a barrister and liberal political light, and pumped him for all sorts of information for the new story I'm writing, which has been hung up for some time for lack of legal details. He is being simply sweet about it, and takes a tremendous interest in working out the details. It's a very unusual case, a peer tried for murder, of course before the House of Lords, and he didn't know the procedure himself when I asked, but he made a point of finding out all about it yesterday from Lord Russell, who was tried for bigamy some time ago, and took me out to coffee this morning and simply filled me with priceless information. Also, he has promised to take me some time when there is an interesting case on in the Lords to show me what it looks like. Also, that's a bit of her research, and I also found this delightful website called Peschel Press, Peschel Press.com, that has annotated whimsy material. So it goes through almost all of the whimsy books and short stories and has these annotations about them. It's amazing. Anyway, Peschel Press confirms Sayers' research about the legal procedures that were, by the way above her station. Remember that Clouds of Witness was just her second novel. She didn't really have a good publishing deal yet. And she was far, far from being a celebrity, let alone nobility, which she never was. Yet, she was a scholar by training, and so put in a great deal of accurate research towards a career that was not certain. By the way, Peschel Press does note when she gets things wrong. I mean, there's a little bit of geography in London that she's a little bit off. So when they say that she's right about the parliamentary procedure, that seems to be believable. Today, research is easier than ever. Sayers actually had to go to libraries and archives for her research. She had to make telephone calls, write letters. I sit in shorts and a sweatshirt at home and go to the Internet Archive, which, by the way, you can find Robert Graves' infamous translation of Lucan's Pharsalia, that's a work, where, by the way, you can find Robert Graves' infamous translation of Lucan's Pharsalia. On the other hand, we have to sift through a lot more material. Certainly there was error published in Sayers' day, but it's one thing to get a publishing house or a pamphlet printer to churn out unchecked or underdeveloped assertions. It's another and far easier thing to publish them on the internet. It's a terrifying thing to talk about this, by the way, on a podcast that I created and produced. If it's any comfort to listeners, the ghost of Sayers fills my office every time I put out one of these episodes. When I meet her in glory, the last thing I want to hear is, "You got that all wrong." Which leads me to a few issues bigger than even academic or novelistic integrity. Sayers once wrote to an undergraduate, "One must not misrepresent matters, even in the interests of one's own dogmatic convictions." Zeal of any sort is not an excuse to distort facts, and from my own experience, this distortion of facts comes most often in the form of a straw man, which I'll explain in a second if you don't know that term. It's one thing for me as a Christian to rigorously understand the facts of my own religion. A lot of Christians do that. But am I also committed to accurately representing the doctrines of Islam when I'm talking about it, including its nuances? Or do I paint the religion I disagree with a broad, disfiguring brush, while I employ detail and patience with my own religion? I once heard a presentation at an education conference that stated this beautifully. The presenter, whose name was Bruce Eder, called it the Dostoevsky principle, because of how convincingly a Christian Dostoevsky portrayed an atheist argument in The Brothers Karamazov. Eder argued, and I heartily agree, that teachers should make students present the strongest, most accurate arguments of an opposing worldview. That's what Dostoevsky did, and that's one of the reasons his works are still worth reading today. If students don't follow the Dostoevsky principle, they are attacking a straw man, a misrepresentation that may be easy to defeat, but is not the real opponent. And Sayers would call this intellectual dishonesty. It is error. Let's conclude by returning to Sayers' letter about the monster error in The Fairy Queen. Do you remember that when the mother died, her babies came back, drank her blood, and exploded? Sayers disagrees. My experience is that they gallop off in all directions and are almost impossible to overtake. I think she's right. Writers need to get their facts straight. Quotations in their papers or posts need to be properly attributed. Opposing points of view need to be conveyed so accurately that those who hold that point of view can't argue with how it's portrayed. As we wrap up, here's one idea for writing practice, or actually just life practice. Find a doctrine of a worldview or lifestyle you disagree with. Research it thoroughly. Have you understood it accurately? Note, you still don't have to agree with it. Have you considered what motivated its formation? How have its followers interpreted it? And a concluding exhortation. Don't let your writing, whether it's a school paper, a novel, or a text, breed little error monsters. Thank you for joining me in this discussion of integrity. To read a transcript or continue the discussion, join us at the Sayers Guild at www.sayersguild.com, where you can read some great Sayers quotes, ask some questions, and contribute to the growing awareness of Sayers' work. God bless you.